I was on my way to my daughter Emily's house expecting nothing more complicated than roasted chicken laughter from my granddaughter Sophie, and an evening that reminded me why I had built everything I had. After a week buried in quarterly reports and endless meetings, the thought of a quiet family dinner in Palo Alto felt like a reward I had earned. I had even picked up a small box of chocolates on the way, Sophie's favorite. The freeway stretched out ahead of me, sunlight beginning to fade behind the San Francisco skyline in the distance. The radio played softly some old jazz station that reminded me of nights Helen and I once spent in tiny clubs before Carter innovations had taken over our lives. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine that Helen would be waiting at the dinner table too, smiling across at me with her knowing eyes. The image made my chest ache, but it was a warm ache, a reminder of love rather than loss. That was when my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with the name Mark Daniels, my lawyer, a friend of 30 years. My first instinct was to ignore it. I was almost at Emily's house, and it could surely wait until Monday. But the message he had sent was simple, urgent, and unlike anything I had ever seen from him. Call me immediately. Emergency regarding Emily. My heart skipped. My hands tightened on the wheel. I pulled off the highway into a gas station parked under the dim lights and dialed. The line clicked, and Mark's voice came through, clipped professional, but with an undercurrent I had never heard from him before. William, I need you to listen carefully. Emily has filed a petition in court. She is attempting to have you declared legally incompetent to run Carter Innovations. I stared through the windshield, unable to breathe for a moment. That's impossible, I managed. She's my daughter. She's acting with a coalition of shareholders, he said. They claim you've lost your edge due to emotional instability. The documentation is extensive. His words felt like a knife driven straight into my chest. Emily, my Emily. I'd been planning to tell her soon that I was preparing to name her CEO within the year. I had thought of it as a gift, a legacy, a torch passed with pride, and now I was hearing that she was orchestrating a coup against me. Mark's voice pressed on. They've gathered financial records, highlighted decisions they call erratic, testimonies from board members about supposed emotional outbursts. They're painting a picture of a man in decline, William, a man unfit to lead. I dropped back against the seat. The hum of cars on the freeway blurred with the pounding in my ears. For a moment, all I could see was Emily, at 6 years old, standing in the garage next to me as I sketched early circuit designs on scraps of paper. She had always wanted to sit on my lap and watch me work her little hands, grabbing my pencils, her eyes wide with wonder. That girl had grown into a woman I thought I understood, brilliant, ambitious, determined. But I had never imagined betrayal this sharp, this public. How much time do I have? I asked, though my mouth was so dry, it barely sounded like me. The hearing is in 1 week. We need to move quickly. 1 week. That was nothing. I had spent 30 years building Carter Innovations from the ground up. 30 years of sacrifices, of nights I didn't come home, of missed dinners with Helen and missed birthdays for Emily, all for the future I thought I was securing for them. And now that future was standing in court, armed with paperwork to prove I was unfit to be the man I had always been. I ended the call in a daze. The gas station neon glowed harshly against the hood of my car. I could have turned around, driven home, buried myself in documents. But habit, or maybe instinct, sent me back toward Palo Alto. Dinner with Emily. Dinner with Sophie. Dinner with the family I thought I still had. The drive felt endless. Every mile was heavy with memories, doubts, and questions I couldn't answer. Had I been too controlling in meetings? Had my grief after Helen's death shown more than I realized? I had thought my passion for the company was a strength. But what if others had seen it as instability? What if Emily had seen it that way? By the time I pulled into her neighborhood, night had settled in. The houses lined the street like quiet fortresses, each one glowing warmly inside. Emily's house stood near the corner lights, blazing, the smell of roasted chicken escaping faintly through the open windows. From the outside, it looked perfect, a family home, safe and welcoming. From the inside, I now knew it was something else entirely. I sat in the car for a few moments, gripping the steering wheel. I thought about turning around, pretending I had another meeting. Anything to avoid facing the daughter who had just declared war on me. But I also knew I needed to see her face, to understand what she had become. Finally, I opened the door, stepped into the cool night, and walked toward the house. My heart was heavy, each step pulling me deeper into a story I never thought I would live. The door opened before I could knock. Emily stood there in a cream sweater, her smile rehearsed, her eyes unreadable. "Dad," she said, her voice light, almost too light. "Right on time. Come in. It's cold out." Her hug was brief, practiced, almost a performance. The kind of embrace you give when you want to prove something to an audience, not when you want to comfort a father. Behind her, I heard Sophie's laughter echoing from the kitchen. That sound, at least, was real. I stepped inside, and the warmth of the house wrapped around me, but it felt false. The walls smelled of family dinners and home-cooked meals, but underneath it all, I smelled deception. I followed Emily into the kitchen, where her husband Daniel was pouring wine. He greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. For a moment, I looked around and saw the life I thought I had helped create. A happy daughter, a stable home, a family gathered around the dinner table. But all I could feel was the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. I smiled for Sophie when she bounded into my arms, but inside something in me had cracked. That night, everything had changed. Sophie's arms wrapped tightly around my neck, her laughter ringing like bells in my ears. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to forget the call, to forget the legal documents that now define my daughter's intentions. She smelled of crayons and soap, the simple innocence of childhood, untouched by the shadows gathering around us. "Grandpa, come see what I made," she said, tugging at my sleeve, her paint-stained overalls a badge of her little rebellions against neatness. I followed her into the kitchen. The table was set with careful precision-polished silverware, neatly folded napkins, the good plates reserved for special occasions. Emily moved between the stove and the counter with practiced grace, each gesture deliberate. Daniel hovered nearby, his tone cheerful, though his movements betrayed a nervous energy. He poured me a glass of wine before I had the chance to ask the kind of hospitality that felt more like management than kindness. The room smelled of roasted chicken rosemary and garlic, a recipe Helen had once loved. I could almost see her standing at our old kitchen counter apron tied at the waist, telling me that cooking was about love, not perfection. Emily had learned that lesson once. Tonight, I couldn't be sure. Sophie placed a drawing in my hand's stick figures in what appeared to be Carter Innovations colors. A little girl's interpretation of the office I had built with sweat and stubbornness. In her sketch, she had drawn me behind a massive desk, smiling while she sat in a spinning chair beside me. It was a picture of the world as she saw it, simple, safe, hopeful. I kissed her forehead, murmuring how beautiful it was, even as my chest tightened. Emily watched us from across the kitchen, her eyes unreadable. For a moment, something flickered guilt, hesitation, calculation, but it passed quickly, replaced by the polished calm of a woman in control of her stage. "Dad, you look tired," she said, her tone casual, but the words carried weight. "Maybe you should rest more." A loaded statement. She wasn't just talking about rest, she was laying the groundwork. I met her eyes and forced a smile. Work keeps me sharp. Dinner unfolded with a mechanical rhythm. Sophie chattered about preschool, her joy untouched by the currents beneath the table. Daniel spoke of his latest architectural project in Oakland, filling the silence with safe details. Emily asked questions about my health, my sleep, whether I was managing stress. Each word was laced with suggestion, an invisible thread leading back to the courtroom petition I had just learned about. The food was good. The chicken was seasoned perfectly, the vegetables roasted just right. But it tasted hollow. Every bite carried with it the knowledge that my daughter had already declared me unfit. I was sitting in a home that smelled of warmth and family, while across the table sat the woman preparing to dismantle everything I had built. I looked around at the walls lined with family photos. Emily's graduation, her wedding day, Sophie's first steps frozen in smiling frames. These images told one story, but tonight I was beginning to understand there had always been another story running beneath them, resentments I hadn't seen, disappointments I hadn't acknowledged. Sophie asked me to tell the story of the first computer I ever built. Her small voice broke the tension for a moment, and I smiled at her request. "That was before your mommy was born," I began. I had nothing but ideas and determination. I glanced at Emily, watching her slice the chicken with surgical precision, her face calm, detached. Helen's memory hung between us. Sophie mentioned her grandmother in passing, a reminder that Helen had once been the glue that kept us together. Emily's shoulders tightened, her knife paused, and I realized then how much unspoken history lived in this room. Helen had tried to warn me that my devotion to the company might cost me my family. I hadn't listened. Mom always said cooking was about love, Emily remarked suddenly, her tone sharp, almost challenging. Yes, I said softly. She was wise about many things. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Even Sophie in her innocence sensed it, looking between her mother and me with wide eyes. Children know more than we think. Dessert came and went. Coffee was poured. The conversation limped along, each topic carefully chosen to avoid the reality sitting at the center of the table. It was a family dinner, performed like theater, every smile painted on, every gesture calculated. At 8:15, I stood thanking them for dinner. It was perfect. I said the words sounding foreign, even to me. Emily walked me to the door, her expression softening slightly. Dad, are you sure you're okay? You seem different tonight. I studied her face, searching for the daughter I once knew. The concern looked genuine, but I no longer trusted my ability to read her. Perhaps she truly believed this was for my own good. Perhaps she had convinced herself of it. I'm fine, I replied, just reflecting on how much the company means to me, to our family. Something shifted in her eyes, then something guarded, as though I had brushed against the truth. She kissed my cheek lightly, her body stiff, then stepped back. Drive safely. The roads are slick tonight. The door closed behind me with a soft click. I stood on her porch, the night air heavy with the scent of rain. Through the window, I could see her moving around the kitchen, clearing dishes with efficient motions. From here, she looked like the perfect daughter, the perfect host, the perfect mother. But I knew better now. As I walked back to my car, Sophie's drawing clutched in my hand, the reality sank in. My daughter, the little girl who once waited by the window for me to come home, was now waiting for me to fall. She wasn't just challenging me. She was preparing to erase me. I sat in the car for a long moment, the engine silent, the windshield streaked with raindrops. The drawing lay across my lap, bright crayon colors against the gray night. A child's world, simple and safe, colliding with the storm her mother had unleashed. When I finally started the engine, the sound felt too loud in the quiet neighborhood. Headlights cut through the darkness as I pulled away, leaving behind a home that had once been a refuge and was now the staging ground for betrayal. The rain began again as I merged onto the highway, steady, relentless, each drop echoing the heaviness in my chest. The city lights blurred through the windshield, and I realized with a painful clarity that nothing about my life would ever be the same again. Dinner at Emily's house had confirmed what Mark's call had already revealed. The battle wasn't just in court. It was in my family, in the spaces where love should have lived. And I had only 7 days to prove that I wasn't the man they claimed I was. I didn't sleep. Coffee at 4, the kitchen dark except for the blue tick of the microwave clock, the bay a smudged strip beyond the window. Sophie's crayon drawing leaned by the sugar jar like a tiny flag. The spinning chair she'd sketched steadied me and indicted me at once. By 7, I was in Soma, swiping my badge as if routine could forgive anything. The guard gave a softened smile. I rode the elevator alone, unlocked my office, and stood in the hush. Prototypes lined the credenza frame patents, Helen's photo under the lamp's warm cone. Mark arrived at 8 with a leather folder. He nodded at Helen's picture, then opened the folder and laid out the war. The petition is in San Francisco Superior Court. Emily asks to suspend my authority as CEO pending an independent evaluation of competence. Co-signers Richard Cole of Bayview Growth, Patricia Mason, the Operations Hawk 2 Momentum Funds, and a consultant who has never built anything except decks. Their brief stitches 6 months of minutes and emails into a portrait they can sell. My refusal to take a predatory bid from Archer Dynamics becomes erratic volatility. Expanding our retention program reads as sentimental spending tied to bereavement. The Helen Carter Foundation partnership that tutors first-gen kids in Oakland is reframed as non-core outlay with no shareholder benefit. On paper, love becomes flaw. Patience becomes symptom. Mark read in a surgeon's cadence, charts where arrows sprinted upward for 2 quarters and then vanished into conjecture. Incidents, a raised voice in a negotiation, a minute of silence while I looked at Helen's photo. A Friday I canceled dinner because a lab team was drowning and I stayed with pizza. Devotion redrafted as decline. How long, I asked. 1 week, he said. Enough if we move precisely. We made lists. Numbers 4, quarters of steady growth, renewals, rarely in headlines, cash reserves, churn, net promoter scores, retention that embarrasses competitors. People, engineers who would speak plainly, Managers who could explain what our culture prevents, panic shortcuts, opportunistic cruelty as clearly as what it produces. Customers who stayed because a human answered the phone when their world failed. Medical 3 independent evaluations. While Mark spoke, I wrote names. It slowed my breath. Stephen Harris first in darker ink. He has been with me since the Sunset Garage when solder smoke lived in our hair. He hates microphones and loves machines, and he knows this company by touch. At 9, I called him. I kept my voice flat and told him the fax audit internal communications map, shareholder sentiment draft a memo that explains culture as operating leverage rather than nostalgia. He didn't ask if I was okay. 20 minutes, he said, and hung up. Friendship at 60 is efficient. Silence bargained while I waited. It showed me candles I missed plays watched on a phone Helen at a table set for 3. I had believed for years that providing was love in a dialect the world respected. Now I saw how love without presence becomes math where a child needed music. Realizations at 62 arrive like invoices. Stephen came in with fog on his shoulders and certainty in his hands. He drew 3 columns on the whiteboard: financial truth, cultural truth, legal truth. Anchor on facts, he said. Don't swing at theater. Under financial truth, he listed cohort retention patient bets now paying conservative debt. Under cultural truth, he wrote stories the customer we kept because Mia from support stayed past midnight. The senior engineer we retained because we refused a flashy pivot. Under legal truth, he listed discovery and timelines. I asked Mark whether I should call Emily. He shook his head. Not yet. Anything you say will be braided into their story. I turned my phone face down. The urge to text "I'm still your father" moved through my hands like current and then was gone. By late morning, the floor outside my office sounded different. Sarah, my assistant, moved like a metronome between departments, collecting minutes, tagging emails, booking witnesses, reminding managers to speak in their own words. I heard her laugh and felt an absurd gratitude. Someone here could still be human without permission. We ate paper sandwiches and kept going. The light over the Embarcadero brightened, dulled, brightened again. A ferry carved a white seam across the bay. Scale rearranged itself in my head. How small a person is against a skyline. How immense a single decision becomes when you point it at family. In the afternoon, we drafted my affidavit. I wrote it in my voice and let Mark trim the edges. I described our health without swagger. I laid out decisions that looked emotional only if you amputated the timeline. I mentioned Helen once not as a shield, but as truth. I kept loving my wife by caring for the place where she hung her hopes. When I finished, my handwriting had narrowed to a disciplined line. It looked like someone finally standing up after a storm. Before we left, Stephen handed me a sheet of printer paper. 3 sentences, no logo. We build things that last. We do not trade people for quarters. We tell the truth, even when it hurts. I taped it to my monitor. It felt like a prayer that was also a policy. I stepped into the lobby after dark. Wet concrete winter air. The guard lifted his hand. I returned it, grateful for the ritual. Outside, the wind came off the water clean and a little cruel. I opened my coat and let the cold finish waking me. 7 days isn't a lifetime, but it is still enough to remember who you are. I tucked the file against my ribs and walked into the night, a man with lists witnesses and the stubborn, ordinary courage that built this company in the first place. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Sleep had become an unreliable ally. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily's expression at the dinner table, poised, careful, detached. I saw Helen's eyes, too filled with warnings I had ignored years ago. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I made coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the kitchen table with a yellow pad of paper, writing names. Allies, witnesses. People who could speak to my competence and my character when words alone might fail. By the time the sun began climbing over the San Francisco Bay, I had 3 pages of lists. Engineers who had built Carter innovations with me. Managers who had watched me work late into the night, not because I was unstable, but because I cared. Employees who could tell stories of the culture we had cultivated and not perfect, never perfect, but decent human. At 9, Stephen Harris arrived with his old leather briefcase and his restless energy. He had been with me since the garage days back when our first prototypes sputtered more than they functioned, and we ate cheap noodles while dreaming of something bigger. His face carried the lines of shared battles. He didn't ask how I was. He simply sat across from me, opened his briefcase, and pulled out sheets of data. Shareholder mapping, he said. The pages were marked in colors. Green for loyal, red for those Emily had already persuaded, yellow for the undecided, the ones who could be swayed by the right story, the right evidence, the right reminder of what Carter Innovations stood for. Too much red, more than I had expected. Emily had been thorough, more thorough than I'd wanted to believe. She's promising them numbers, Stephen said, his finger tapping on a section highlighted in red. 25% growth projection staff cuts AI-driven efficiencies. All aggressive, none sustainable. But shareholders don't always care about sustainability. They care about returns. I leaned back in my chair, the words pressing down like lead. Returns. That word had become a sword sharper than loyalty, sharper than decades of shared work. To them, numbers were safer than people. Emily was weaponizing that hunger, feeding them fantasies of explosive growth, carving away everything we had built, piece by piece. Mark joined us shortly after, briefcase in hand, eyes sharp behind his glasses. He spread out legal documents across the table, battle plans in paper form. We have to dismantle her argument systematically, he said. Prove that your so-called emotional decisions were in fact strategic. We need evidence, testimony, financial reports. And we need to do it in a way that cuts through the theater she and her lawyer will stage. I looked at the stack of papers, each one a piece of my life reframed as weakness. The Anderson acquisition, I had turned down a predatory offer because it undervalued our work. Emily had called it irrational proof of volatility. The retention program, I had approved it because good people deserved security, and security built loyalty. She had painted it as sentimentality. Helen's foundation partnership, I had funded it because it mattered, because our company had an obligation to the community. Emily had labeled it indulgence born from grief. The facts had been twisted into weapons, and now I had to untwist them in front of strangers who would decide my future. We spent hours at the conference table. Stephen outlined case studies of other tech firms that had chased numbers Emily's way, cutting too deep, automating too quickly, promising growth that collapsed within years. Mark drafted legal arguments, framing each of Emily's accusations against the hard evidence of Carter Innovations' steady growth, high retention, satisfied clients. I sat mostly in silence, absorbing, reflecting, feeling the weight of both betrayal and responsibility. At one point, Stephen pushed back from the table and stared at me. William, you have to understand something. This isn't just about proving you're competent. It's about reminding them who you are. You built this company from a garage with nothing but a mortgage and a prayer. You held it together through downturns, through Helen's illness, through everything. You can't just defend yourself. You have to embody what they'll lose if they follow her. His words settled heavily on me. Embody what they'll lose. The thought of becoming a symbol, not just a man, unnerved me. But maybe that was what this fight required. The afternoon stretched long. Papers piled, coffee cooled, rain streaked the windows, Seattle gray transplanted into San Francisco skies. I walked to the glass and looked out at the skyline, remembering the years when I had stared at similar windows, imagining a future I thought would be safe. I had believed I was building for Emily, for Helen, for Sophie. I had believed legacy would be enough. Now I saw that legacy without love could breed resentment sharper than any enemy from outside. When I returned to the table, Mark handed me a list of shareholder names. Richard Cole, Patricia Mason, the undecideds. You need to talk to them, he said, face to face. Not in court, not through documents. They need to hear you. They need to remember why they trusted you in the first place. The idea exhausted me, but I nodded. Richard first. Private lunch. Neutral ground. A chance to remind him that numbers weren't everything, that long-term stability meant more than Emily's fantasy projections. As the day wound down, I found myself pacing between my desk and the window. My body felt restless, but inside I was heavy burdened by memories that wouldn't stay quiet. Helen at the hospital whispering that Emily needed me more than the company. Emily at her college graduation scanning the crowd for my face, finding only an empty seat because I was stuck in a meeting. Birthdays I had skipped, vacations I had cut short, promises broken in the name of building something I thought was for them. Now here I was, standing in a war room of papers and charts, strategizing against my own daughter. The irony was cruel. When Stephen finally left, he placed his hand on my shoulder. Don't let her turn this into a question of love. She'll win if it stays there. Make it about truth, about what works. I nodded, but when the door closed, I sank into my chair, staring at the photo of Helen on my desk. Her smile was patient, knowing the kind of smile that saw through me, even now. I whispered to her, though the room was empty. Did I do this? Did I push her here? The only answer was the rain on the glass, steady, relentless, as though the world itself was reminding me that storms never stop simply because we want them to. By the time I left the office, night had fallen again. The city lights shimmered on the wet streets, reflections of something brighter than I felt inside. I carried my briefcase to the car, heavy with documents, heavy with the burden of fatherhood twisted into war. Tomorrow, I would sit across from Richard Cole and try to save not just my company, but a lifetime of work, of meaning, of identity. I wasn't sure yet how to do it, but I knew one thing: this fight was no longer optional. I arrived early to Morton's downtown, a steakhouse chosen for its neutrality. It was the kind of place where deals had been struck for decades, where red leather booths absorbed secrets, and the scent of char lingered in the walls. Richard Cole was due at noon, but I came at 11:30, needing the quiet before performance. I took a booth near the window, ordered coffee, and stared out at the passing world. The city was alive with movement, office workers hurrying with umbrellas, cabs nosing through traffic, a guitarist on the corner playing for coins. Normal life, unaware that mine was unraveling in court documents and shareholder whispers. Richard arrived precisely at 12, punctual as always. His suit was immaculate, his handshake firm, his eyes sharp with calculation. He had always been that way, straightforward, practical, the kind of investor who measured everything in percentages. He had once told me that loyalty was admirable but not profitable. At the time, I had laughed. Now I wasn't sure it was a joke. We exchanged small talk, ordered lunch. But beneath the surface, the true conversation loomed like thunderclouds. I could see it in the way he tapped his fork against the table, in the way his gaze lingered too long on the menu, though he already knew what he'd order. Finally, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "William, you know why we're here." I nodded. Words felt heavier than the steak knives at our place settings. "Emily's been talking to you." "She has," he said simply. "Her vision is bold, aggressive, but bold is what this industry needs. The world is changing, William. Companies that don't adapt, they collapse." I finished for him. "I know the narrative, but she's selling you a dream, Richard. Dreams don't build companies. Discipline does. Patience does." He tilted his head, watching me like a chess player gauging an opponent's move. "She's promising a 25% growth trajectory within 3 years. That's hard to ignore." I pulled a folder from my briefcase and slid it across the table. Inside were charts carefully prepared by Stephen the night before. Read these numbers: 12% annual growth for the last 5 years, 94% retention, industry-leading customer satisfaction. These aren't dreams, they're reality. Sustainable, steady, strong. He flipped through the pages, expression unreadable. "Richard," I said quietly, my voice low enough that only he could hear, "you've been with us long enough to know that this company doesn't gamble with people's lives. Emily's strategy isn't modernization, it's mutilation. Automation and cuts might look good for a quarter or two, but they'll hollow out what we've built. And when that happens, the company won't recover." He set the folder down. His eyes softened just slightly, and I knew I had touched something. "You've always been sentimental about culture," he said, but there was no malice in his tone. "Culture is why we've lasted," I answered. "Other companies tripled their stock price by gutting staff. Where are they now, ruins? You remember TechFlow Industries." His lips tightened. Everyone remembered TechFlow, a darling of Wall Street one year, a carcass the next. They had automated everything, cut staff to the bone, promised endless growth. Within 5 years, they were irrelevant, their customer service a joke, their retention rate non-existent. "That's Emily's model," I said. "That's what you're buying if you follow her." Silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of history. He sipped his water, set it down carefully, then said, "She's persuasive, younger, more in touch with where the market is heading. And I'm the man who built the foundation," I said. "The man who understands that companies aren't just machines, they're organisms. You can't starve them for the sake of appearances. You can't trade people for numbers and expect to survive." I thought of Helen then, of the nights she sat at the kitchen table waiting for me to come home, of the look in Emily's eyes at her graduation when she realized I wasn't there. I had sacrificed pieces of myself, of my family, for this company. maybe too many. But I had never sacrificed its people. I would not let Emily do it now. The food arrived. Neither of us touched it for a long while. The conversation hung heavy, sharper than the steak knives. Richard studied me as though weighing two futures on a scale. Finally, he said, "I haven't made my decision yet, but you've given me something to think about." It wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat either. It was a foothold, a pause, a possibility. When the lunch ended, we shook hands again. His grip was steady, but I felt the hesitation in it. He wasn't lost to Emily completely, not yet. As I walked back to my car, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under a hesitant sun. The air smelled clean, almost hopeful, but inside I felt only exhaustion. Convincing Richard was just one battle in a war that had only begun. Patricia Mason would be harder, colder, less sentimental, driven entirely by numbers. And beyond her were the undecideds, the ones who could tip the balance either way. I sat in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the city skyline. For decades, I had believed that numbers told the whole story. Revenue growth percentages, they had been my compass. But today, I realized the truth was larger than that. The story wasn't just about numbers, it was about memory, loyalty, sacrifice. It was about people who had given their lives to something because they believed it mattered. And now my daughter was trying to erase all of it. When I returned to the office, Stephen was waiting. How'd it go? "He's not lost," I said, "but he's not with us yet." Stephen nodded. "Then we keep working. We show them facts. We show them what happens when companies chase fantasies. We remind them who William Carter is." I sat at my desk long after Stephen left the city outside, dimming into evening. Papers covered my desk charts, affidavits, testimonies waiting to be gathered. The fight ahead was enormous. But what weighed on me more than any legal battle was the simple, undeniable truth. My daughter had chosen to stand on the other side. The greatest battle wasn't for the company. It was for her. The courthouse loomed over Civic Center like a block of stone carved from authority itself. Its columns were weathered, its steps slick from a morning rain that seemed to hang over San Francisco in endless gray sheets. I had walked into buildings like this 100 times in my life, boardrooms, banks' offices, but never had my legs felt so heavy. Never had I felt like a man about to be weighed and measured not by numbers, but by shadows of his own family. I arrived early. Mark insisted we should project composure, that nervous energy was a currency we couldn't afford to spend. I sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, papers tucked into my briefcase, watching the minutes crawl across the clock. Around me, lawyers hustled clerks, shuffled documents, heels clicked against marble. To them, this was routine. To me, it was a lifetime on trial. When Emily entered, my chest clenched. She wore a navy suit sharp and controlled her hair pulled back in a style that seemed more armor than elegance. She did not look at me. Instead, she walked straight to her legal team, greeting them with confidence that might as well have been rehearsed. Laura Blackwell, her attorney, was at her side, tall, severe, every movement calculated to project dominance. I had read about her victories stacked like trophies, a reputation for turning courtrooms into theater. She didn't even glance at me. I wasn't a father to her, just a defendant. The room filled slowly. Shareholders I had once shaken hands with now took seats like spectators in an arena, eager to see who would emerge victorious. Some nodded politely in my direction, others avoided my eyes. Loyalty was fickle when money whispered promises. The judge entered silver-haired, his robe flowing like gravity itself. The bailiff called the case Carter versus Carter Innovations. The words echoed in my chest. My name, my company, my daughter, all bound together in a legal script written by betrayal. Laura stood first. Her voice was smooth, measured, practiced for the jury of shareholders and the watching press. Your Honor, this case concerns the decline of a once great leader, a man whose judgment, though brilliant in the past, has been compromised by grief, stubbornness, and resistance to change. She gestured toward me with the ease of someone wielding a scalpel. Mr. Carter is no longer fit to manage a company of this size and importance. His emotional instability threatens shareholder value, employee security, and the company's future. We present evidence of erratic decisions, emotional outbursts, and a refusal to modernize. We ask the court to grant temporary guardianship of Carter Innovations to his daughter, Emily Carter, until a full evaluation of his competence can be completed. Her words were honey laced with poison, a story crafted with just enough truth to seem believable. The documents she projected on the screen looked clinical, damning board minutes highlighting my objections, financial reports twisted into signs of weakness, Emails I had written at midnight after Helen's death, reframed as instability. Then came Emily. She was sworn in, her voice steady, her posture perfect. I watched her take the stand, my daughter, my flesh and blood, speaking words that cut deeper than any stranger's accusation. My father is guided by emotion, not reason. He makes decisions based on sentiment rather than strategy. The retention program he approved after my mother's death cost us hundreds of thousands with no measurable return. He refuses to consider automation or AI despite industry trends. He clings to outdated methods, jeopardizing our future. Her voice did not tremble. Each statement landed like a stone on my chest. I searched her face for hesitation, for guilt, for the little girl who once begged me to tell her bedtime stories. But there was nothing. Only resolve shaped by years of watching me choose the company over family sharpened now into a blade aimed at my throat. Mark leaned close and whispered, "Stay calm, don't react." But my hands tightened in my lap. My heart hammered against my ribs. The courtroom swam with memories, missed birthdays, broken promises, Helen's voice telling me Emily needed more of me than I had given. Was this the harvest of all that neglect? Laura guided Emily through example after example. The Anderson acquisition framed as a reckless outburst when I rejected their insulting offer. The partnership with Helen's foundation dismissed as indulgence born of grief. Each example painted me as a man unraveling, clinging to sentiment while the world surged ahead. By the time Emily stepped down, the air in the courtroom felt heavy, suffocating. She walked past me without a glance, her heels clicking like punctuation marks to a sentence I hadn't agreed to. Then it was my turn. Mark rose steady as stone, his voice cutting through the fog. "Your Honor, we intend to show that William Carter is not only competent, but exemplary. That his decisions labeled emotional by the plaintiff were in fact grounded in strategy and have preserved this company's strength for decades." He called witnesses, introduced documents, built a counter-narrative brick by brick. But I knew the true test was still ahead. I would have to take the stand. I would have to look my daughter in the eye while she tried to strip me of everything I had built. As the session closed for the day, I gathered my papers with mechanical movements. The judge set the next hearing for tomorrow morning. My legs felt unsteady as I left the courtroom, descending the marble steps into the gray afternoon. Reporters clustered outside, shouting questions. I ignored them, moving through the rain like a man half dreaming. Emily walked ahead with her team, their umbrellas bobbing like shields. She didn't look back, not once. That night, back in my empty house, I sat in my study with Helen's photograph, watching from the desk. I poured a glass of scotch and stared at the walls lined with decades of achievements, awards, patents, photos from groundbreaking ceremonies. They had once meant triumph. Tonight they felt like exhibits in a museum no one wanted to visit anymore. I whispered to Helen's picture, my voice barely audible in the stillness. "She's trying to erase me." The rain tapped against the window like an answer I didn't want to hear. Tomorrow I would face the courtroom again. Tomorrow the war would deepen. The rain had barely stopped when I returned to the courthouse the next morning. The air was sharp, washed clean, but inside my chest, the storm still raged. My briefcase felt heavier than usual, though its weight was only paper and truth. Mark walked beside me, his stride, even his eyes fixed ahead. Stephen was already inside, carrying files that felt more like weapons than documents. The courtroom buzzed when we entered. Whispers slid across the gallery, shareholders speculating, reporters scribbling. I ignored them all. My eyes found Emily seated at her table, poised, unreadable. She looked smaller today, though maybe it was just my own perspective shifting. Last night, I had stared at numbers, bank records, email chains, evidence that told a different story than the one she had painted. A story I never wanted to know, but could no longer ignore. Mark began with quiet precision. He introduced the court to a series of documents we had uncovered in discovery. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "we have identified unauthorized transfers totaling $900,000 moved from Carter Innovations accounts into entities connected to the plaintiff's legal campaign. These funds were diverted without board approval, without documentation, and in direct violation of fiduciary duty." The room stirred. I watched as Emily's expression faltered just slightly, a tightening of her jaw, a flicker in her eyes. Laura Blackwell objected, of course, claiming irrelevance, desperation, theatrics. The judge overruled. Mark projected the bank statements on the screen, each line glowing like a wound. Dates, amounts, recipient accounts. There was no denying the numbers. This, Mark continued, is not stewardship. It is embezzlement dressed as ambition. I kept my gaze fixed on Emily. For the first time, she looked away. Stephen stepped forward next with internal communications, emails between Emily and department heads, transcripts from meetings whispered behind closed doors, promises of 20% salary increases 30% for department heads' stock options that did not exist. He read excerpts aloud, his voice calm, his delivery brutal in its simplicity. The courtroom shifted uneasily. Shareholders who had sat stiff with confidence the day before now leaned forward, brows furrowed. They had been promised miracles. Now they saw the math unravel into fraud. Laura rose again, sharp as a blade, claiming misinterpretation, exaggeration, the natural ambition of leadership. But her voice carried less certainty now. The weight of paper was against her. And then came the most damning piece. Mark laid down a transcript accompanied by a grainy audio clip from building security sweeps. Laura's voice coaching Emily, before the hearing, instructing her exactly how to phrase accusations, how to frame my actions as instability, how to perform grief as strategy, witness tampering plain and undeniable. The judge's face hardened. Even the gallery fell silent, the rustle of papers stilled. In that moment, the tide shifted. When my turn came to testify, I rose slowly, carrying not just my own weight, but the gravity of decades. I took the stand, swore the oath, and looked at the courtroom with clear eyes. I founded Carter Innovations in 1995 with $50,000 borrowed against my home. I began. My voice was steady, though my heart beat like a drum. I built it piece by piece with people who believed in more than just numbers. For 30 years, we have grown, not explosively, not recklessly, but steadily. We have weathered downturns, kept employees when others cut them loose, invested in people when it wasn't fashionable. That isn't instability, that's leadership. Mark guided me with questions, each one opening a window into the truth. Profits 12%, annual growth, retention 94%, far above the industry average. Customer satisfaction consistently in the top 5% of our sector. I answered each carefully, precisely, with the clarity of a man who knew his company not as an abstract, but as a living thing. He asked about the decisions Emily had framed as emotional. I explained them one by one. The Anderson acquisition, a rejection of a predatory offer that would have gutted our value. The retention program, an investment in loyalty that had already paid dividends in stability. The foundation partnership, a commitment to community that strengthened our reputation and employee pride. These were not indulgences, I said softly. They were strategies. Strategies rooted in values, yes, but values that build resilience. A company is not only machines and numbers. It is people, and people cannot be discarded like old equipment. Silence followed. Even Laura's pen had stopped scratching. On cross-examination, she tried to rattle me. She asked if I had ever raised my voice in a meeting. I answered honestly, yes, I had. Passion is not instability. She asked if grief had influenced my decisions after Helen's death. I looked her in the eye and said, grief sharpened my awareness of what matters. It made me more careful, not less. Her questions grew sharper, but her footing slipped. Every accusation she lobbed I met with facts, with memory, with the quiet authority of a man who had lived every inch of this company's story. By the time I stepped down, the mood in the courtroom had changed. Shareholders whispered differently now, not with certainty, but with doubt in Emily's promises, doubt in the vision she had sold them. When Richard Cole was called to testify again, his voice carried hesitation. I may have been overly optimistic about projected returns, he admitted. Perhaps I placed too much faith in projections that were ambitious. His words hung in the air, not yet a surrender, but a retreat. I sat in my chair, exhausted but clear. For the first time since Mark's call at the gas station, I felt the possibility of survival, not just for me, but for the truth of what Carter Innovations had always been. When the day's session ended, Emily avoided my eyes again. But I saw something new in her face, not just determination, but fear. The fortress she had built from numbers and rehearsed accusations was cracking, and she knew it. Back home that night, I sat in my study staring at Helen's photograph. The rain had returned soft against the glass. I whispered to her again, my voice tired but steady. We're not finished yet, but maybe, just maybe, I can still save what we built. I wasn't sure if I meant the company, or our family, or both. The courthouse felt different when we returned on Monday. The The tension that had once weighed against me now pressed on Emily's side. Shareholders who had come eager for revolution now looked uncertain, clutching their binders and murmuring in clusters. Even the reporters had shifted their angle, their eyes flicked toward me with curiosity rather than pity. Inside, the air was still as though the building itself waited for the next act. The judge entered, robe-trailing, expression firm. He wasted no time. "Mr. Daniels, you may proceed." Mark rose, his voice quiet, but edged like steel. "Your Honor, we submit further evidence demonstrating that the plaintiff's projections are not merely optimistic, but reckless. These growth forecasts rely on firing over 40% of current staff, automating customer service, and slashing employee benefits. Not only are these measures unrealistic, they would destroy the company's culture and long-term viability." He moved to the projector and displayed comparative case studies. Tech firms that had surged briefly after adopting Emily's model only to collapse within years. Charts of stock prices climbing like rockets before plummeting into ruins. Carter Innovations has achieved 12% steady growth annually for 5 years, Mark continued. That is not stagnation. That is resilience. To gamble that away on fantasy is not leadership, it is sabotage. The word echoed through the room. Sabotage. Then came the witnesses. Sarah from accounting, her voice nervous but clear, describing how Emily had promised raises and stock options the company could not possibly fund. David from engineering explaining how proposed automation would gut the very systems that held our products together. Each testimony was quiet, professional, unembellished, and each chipped away at the facade Emily had built. I sat watching, my hands folded in my lap, my heart pounding with every sentence. These were my people. They weren't polished speakers, but they were honest. They had chosen to stand by me, not because of loyalty alone, but because they knew the truth. When it was my turn to testify again, I walked to the stand with steady steps. This time, I did not feel like a man defending himself. I felt like a man reminding others of what had always been there. "Mr. Carter," Mark began, "in your opinion, what is the purpose of leadership?" I looked at the gallery, at the shareholders, at the employees who had come to watch. "Leadership," I said slowly, "is not about chasing the highest number on a chart. It is about creating something that lasts. It is about guiding people through storms, making choices that may not shine immediately, but will endure. A company is not only an engine for profit, it is a community. If you destroy that for short-term gains, you destroy everything." Mark let the words hang. Then he asked, "And how has that philosophy served Carter Innovations? We have grown every year for 3 decades. We have one of the highest retention rates in the industry. Customers trust us because they know we will be here tomorrow. That is not weakness. That is strength." The silence that followed was almost reverent. Laura rose for cross-examination. Her tone was sharp, her questions rapid fire, but there was a crack in her composure now. "Mr. Carter, isn't it true you resisted modernization, that you ignored industry trends?" "I resisted reckless change," I answered. "Modernization must serve people, not replace them." She pressed harder. "Isn't it true that you make decisions based on sentiment?" "I make decisions based on experience. 30 years of building this company has taught me that numbers alone do not keep a business alive. People do." Her frustration showed. She accused, prodded, tried to shake me, but each attempt fell against facts, against clarity, against the calm I had found in finally telling the truth. By the time she sat down, her voice had lost its edge. The shift was visible in the room. Richard Cole leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression thoughtful. Patricia Mason scribbled notes with less certainty than before. The undecideds whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Emily and me. And then it was Emily's turn again. She returned to the stand, but the certainty of the first day was gone. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. She tried to defend her projections, framing them as bold vision, necessary evolution. But when Mark pressed her on the numbers, on the impossibility of funding promised raises, on the gaps in her automation plan, her answers wavered. "Ms. Carter," Mark said finally, his tone almost gentle, "did you believe these promises could realistically be delivered?" Emily hesitated. "Just a second too long. I believed they represented potential," she said at last. Potential built on what Mark asked, on firing loyal employees, on cutting the heart out of the company your father built. Her lips tightened. She looked away. The courtroom was silent, save for the judge's pen scratching against paper. By the end of the day, the tide had fully turned. We hadn't won, yet the final ruling still lay ahead, but momentum was no longer hers. The fortress she had built was collapsing under the weight of truth brick by brick, document by document. When the judge adjourned, I gathered my papers slowly, my body tired, but my spirit steady. Emily walked past flanked by her lawyer, her face pale, her movements mechanical. She still did not look at me. Outside, the late afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds. The light bounced off wet pavement, dazzling, almost painful. I stood on the courthouse steps, breathing in the sharp air, feeling for the first time in weeks that I was not drowning. Stephen joined me, his hand on my shoulder. "You turned it," he said simply. I nodded. I felt it too. The war was not over, but for the first time, I believed I could win it. That night at home, I sat in my study with Helen's photograph once more. "We're close," I whispered, "closer than I thought possible." But even as I spoke the words, a hollowness lingered. Winning meant saving the company. It did not mean saving Emily. And as much as I wanted victory, what I wanted more, what I had always wanted, though I had shown it poorly, was my daughter back. The storm was breaking, but what would be left when the skies finally cleared? The courthouse was fuller than ever when the judge returned to deliver his decision. Shareholders packed the gallery, reporters lined the aisles, and the air was tight with anticipation. The case had dragged across weeks of filings, testimonies, and revelations, each day peeling back another layer of what Emily had built. What began as whispers of my supposed incompetence had unraveled into records of her unauthorized transfers, promises she could never fulfill, and coaching sessions caught on tape. But knowing the evidence was on my side didn't make the moment easier. I sat at the defendant's table, hands clasped Helen's face in my memory, Sophie's laughter echoing faintly somewhere beyond all this. I wasn't just defending a company, I was defending my life's meaning. And the cost was measured not only in shares or signatures, but in the distance widening between me and my daughter. The judge's voice cut through the silence. He read his findings with the calm gravity of a man accustomed to final words. After reviewing all testimony, financial records, and evidence presented, the court finds no grounds to declare William Carter incompetent in managing his business affairs. The plaintiff's claims, while initially supported by documentation, have been significantly undermined by evidence of misrepresentation, unauthorized use of funds, and questionable conduct by counsel. I closed my eyes briefly, relief flooding through me. My hands unclenched, but the release was not joy. It was exhaustion, the end of a storm that had left its wreckage everywhere. The judge continued, noting that further review of Emily's financial actions might be necessary, even disciplinary action by regulatory bodies. But I heard none of it fully. My gaze had drifted to Emily, who sat pale, rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes did not rise to meet mine. The gavel fell. Case dismissed. Mr. Carter retains full control of Carter Innovations. The courtroom erupted into a low hum, reporters scribbling, shareholders whispering, attorneys gathering their papers. Mark gripped my shoulder, murmured congratulations. Stephen allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Yet their voices barely reached me. All I could hear was the hollow thud in my chest, the echo of victory that did not feel like triumph. Emily stood slowly, her lawyer at her side. Laura Blackwell's face was set in granite frustration, her career bruised by exposure of her tactics. Emily looked smaller than I had ever seen her, my ambitious, determined daughter reduced to silence. She glanced briefly in my direction, and for the first time in weeks, our eyes met. There was no rage there, no triumph, only confusion, hurt, something fragile. And then it was gone as she turned and walked quickly toward the exit. I did not follow. I couldn't. My legs were too heavy, my spirit too raw. Reporters swarmed outside. Cameras flashed. Questions flew like arrows. How does it feel to win? Do you think your daughter will appeal? What does this mean for Carter Innovations? I kept walking silent, Mark shielding me as best he could. Their noise was a blur. None of them understood that there are no winners when the battlefield is a family. Back home, the house felt cavernous. I loosened my tie, set down my briefcase, and stood in the foyer, surrounded by silence. For 30 years, this house had been filled with Helen's presence, Emily's footsteps, laughter that softened the hard edges of my ambition. Tonight, it was filled with nothing but shadows. I poured myself a drink, sat at my desk, and stared at Helen's photograph. I won, I whispered, though the word felt wrong. What was victory if it meant watching your daughter walk out of a courtroom like a stranger? What was triumph if it left behind only silence? The phone buzzed, Stephen checking in, Mark asking about press statements. I ignored both. Instead, I opened the drawer and pulled out Sophie's crayon drawing. Stick figures, bright colors, innocence. In her picture, Grandpa and Mommy sat together at desks, smiling. A child's hope drawn in uneven lines. Looking at it now, I felt a lump in my throat. She had drawn the world the way it should have been, not the way it was. Over the next few days, the company steadied. Shareholders sent emails affirming their renewed confidence. Analysts praised Carter Innovations for its resilience. The stock held firm. In every external measure, it was a success. But inside, I felt only hollowness. My office was quiet. My home, even quieter. Emily did not call. I did not reach out. A wall had been built between us, one that neither ruling nor report could dismantle. One evening, I walked to the window of my study and looked out over the bay. The water shimmered under the setting sun, beautiful and indifferent. I thought of Emily as a child running into the waves with Helen calling after her, fearless, full of laughter. Where had that little girl gone? Had I buried her under quarterly reports and missed birthdays? Had I taught her that success was the only language worth speaking? Victory had cost me too much. The following week, the board convened for a quarterly review. Stephen presented our numbers calm and methodical. Shareholders asked questions, but the edge of doubt had softened. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the room and saw not investors, but people measuring their futures against mine. We are steady, I told them. We are strong. But strength is not measured only in profit. It is measured in how we treat those who build with us. That will not change under my leadership. They applauded, some politely, some with genuine conviction. Yet, as I stepped down, I thought only of Emily's empty chair. She should have been there at my side, preparing to take the torch in time. Instead, she had tried to snatch it by force, and in the process, burned us both. That night, I returned home, sat at my desk again, and held Helen's photograph. I kept the company, I whispered, but I lost her. The rain had returned steady against the glass, like tears I could not shed. The battle was over, the war was won, but the victory was hollow. 10 days passed after the ruling. 10 days of emails congratulating me, of analysts calling me a visionary, still in control, of shareholders praising my steadiness. To the world, the story had ended with triumph. To me, it ended with silence. Emily had disappeared from view. Her calls absent, her presence missing at every boardroom table and family gathering. I tried to lose myself in routine. Meetings, reports, decisions. The machinery of Carter Innovations turned, as it always had, steady and reliable. But at night, when the offices emptied and I was left alone in the echo of my study, I thought of Emily. Not the woman who testified against me, but the child who once waited by the window for me to come home. The teenager who begged me to attend her recital, the young woman whose ambition I had both admired and neglected. The silence was heavier than defeat. It was Sophie who cracked it. A week after the ruling, she called me with her small voice bright and pure. Grandpa, Mommy is sad. She doesn't smile much. Can you come see us? Her words pierced deeper than any cross-examination. I promised I would. 2 days later, I found myself sitting on a bench overlooking Lake Merritt. The afternoon sun shimmered on the water joggers past with headphones. Children chased ducks at the shore. It was the kind of ordinary beauty I had forgotten to notice in years consumed by deadlines and projections. I arrived early, needing the solitude, the space to prepare for what might come. Emily arrived late, walking slowly across the grass. No suit this time, no armor, just jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger, more fragile, as though the courtroom battles had stripped away the layers she had built around herself. She sat at the opposite end of the bench, leaving space between us. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. I studied her face, searching for anger, for defiance. What I found instead was something softer: tiredness, regret. The steel had melted into something human again. I've been thinking, she began, eyes on the water, about everything I said, everything I did. I thought I was fighting for the company, for its future, but I was really fighting for something else, for recognition, for you to see me. Her voice cracked on the last word. I swallowed hard, the weight of decades pressing down. "Emily, I was always proud of you, always. I didn't show it the way you needed me to." She turned to me, then tears brimming. "I didn't feel it, Dad. I felt like the company came first. Like nothing I did mattered unless it was tied to your work. When Mom tried to tell you, you didn't listen. And when she died, it felt like you buried yourself in the company even deeper. I thought if I took it from you, maybe then you'd finally see me. The honesty cut deeper than the lawsuit ever had. She wasn't wrong. Helen had warned me. Emily had begged in her own way. And I had believed that providing was love, that success was proof of devotion. But love without presence becomes absence, and absence becomes resentment. I reached across the space between us, my hand trembling. She hesitated, then let me hold hers. It was warm, fragile, familiar. You mattered more than anything, I said softly. I just didn't know how to show it. I thought building this company was my way of saying I loved you, but I see now you needed words, presence, attention, and I failed you there. Tears slid down her cheeks, and she didn't hide them. For the first time since the lawsuit began, she looked like my daughter again, not my adversary. What happens now, she whispered. I thought carefully before answering. The company is still here, strong, but it needs both of us. Your innovation, my stability. We don't have to fight for control. We can share it. As partners. As family. She stared at me, eyes wide, as if unsure whether to believe me. You'd trust me after everything. Because of everything I said, you've shown me your strength, and I've learned my limits. Together, maybe we can build something better than either of us alone. She let out a shaky laugh, half disbelief, half relief. Co-CEOs. Co-CEOs, I confirmed, but with rules, transparency, consultation, and family first. No business at Sunday dinners, no missed birthdays, no bedtime stories interrupted by calls. For the first time in months, Emily smiled. Not the polished smile of the courtroom, but the genuine smile I remembered from her childhood. Deal. We shook hands, formal and symbolic, then pulled each other into an embrace that felt like both surrender and salvation. That evening, I went to her house for dinner. Sophie ran into my arms, laughing, the tension gone from her little body. Grandpa, are you and Mommy friends again? She asked. Yes, sweetheart, I said, kissing her forehead. We're partners now. Dinner was different this time. The conversation flowed easily without hidden daggers. Emily and I discussed gradual modernization plans, AI in measured doses, new markets approached with caution. Daniel talked about his architectural project. Sophie showed me her latest drawings. Laughter filled the room where suspicion had once lived. After dessert, Emily brought out a folder. Inside was a draft partnership agreement, shared authority, equal responsibility, dispute resolution, boundaries between work and family. It was simple, elegant, fair. We both signed it that night, Sophie clapping as if she knew we were sealing something important. Trevor brought champagne and we raised glasses. To Carter Innovations, Emily said. To family, I added. To not fighting anymore, Sophie declared solemnly, raising her apple juice. We laughed, clinked glasses, and for the first time in what felt like years, I felt Helen's presence in the room. Her wisdom, her patience, her love. She would have been proud of this moment. Proud of us. Later, as I drove home through the quiet streets, I thought about the journey, the betrayal, the courtroom battles, the evidence that nearly destroyed my daughter, the victory that felt hollow, and now this fragile new beginning. I parked in the driveway, Sophie's drawing on the seat beside me. In it, Grandpa and Mommy sat together at desks smiling, a child's vision of harmony. Tonight, it no longer felt like fantasy. It felt like possibility. I looked up at the stars faint above the bay and whispered, "We're still here, Helen. We're still together." And for the first time in a long time, hope felt real.